الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي بنعمته تتم الصالحات. سبحانك ربنا على ما أنعمت علينا من هداية وعلم وفقه وطلب يا رب العالمين. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيد الأولين والآخرين إمام المتقين الهادي إلى صراط مستقيم سيدنا ونبينا وقرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. This is our first lesson on understanding the essentials of Islamic worship from a great brief text on the topic Ascent to Felicity by Imam Shurunbulali. And this is lesson number 1. So in this course, in covering this text, we're trying to go beyond the very basics. In the Absolute Essentials class, we looked at the very basics of purification and prayer. We also looked at some foundational investigations related to Islamic belief, which are important to review, but we'll be looking at understanding Islamic worship in its key details: purification and prayer, fasting, zakat, and hajj. And the aims first is to look at what are the essential details. Right? Now that we have covered what is the skeletal framework, what are the conditions, the integrals, what are the key details related to each of these acts. Looking a little more at some of the recommended acts, looking in a little more detail at some of the adab, the proper manners, looking at some of the issues that arise. So that, for example, what happens if you make mistakes in prayer? What if you forget? We'll be looking at, for example, what happens if you break your wudu while praying? What if you're the imam? Right? And so on. Details such as congregational prayer, how you lead congregational prayer, what does the follower do, what does the latecomer do, etc. And also, as part of building our understanding of knowledge in general and fiqh in particular, we'll also be looking at some of the legal reasoning underlying these rulings. Okay. Which is what they call the istidlal, right? The legal reasoning. That why is the ruling this way? And that legal ruling is derived from certain primary texts, which are the source proofs. So we'll look at that. Why? One, because understanding increases one's certitude. وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. When Sayyidina Ibrahim asked for a proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creating, he was asked, do you not believe? He said, indeed I do. وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. But for my heart to be at rest. And so it gives one greater understanding, which gives one greater confidence, greater appreciation, which should translate into greater resolve in turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It also enables one to explain the basis, wisdom, benefit of those rulings to others, and to transmit that clarity and confidence to them. It also builds one's legal understanding, so that as one grows in fiqh, one is able to apply those rulings in accordance with the training and principles of this science. As we go through the text, we'll also be looking a little more extensively at the virtues related to the various actions, both specifically referring to the fada'il, the hadiths regarding the virtues of the various acts that we look at, and also encouraging you throughout to refer to the virtues of these various actions. With that, we'll also be touching upon the inward dimensions, the sincerity and presence of heart, and turning inwardly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the actions that we look at. So this is the purpose of the course, and one's intention in it is, of course, to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by increasing in knowledge of guidance, by learning the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to be able to live it and to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through it, and to be able to be of the people of knowledge who can convey that knowledge with its conditions and principles. In today's lesson is in 3 parts or perhaps 4. I have my doubts, but it's either 3 or 4. One of the principles of fiqh is al-adad la mafhuma lahu, that numbers are not of legislative consequence. Like when something is numbered, there are 3 signs of this, it's assumed not to be exclusive. So depending on how you count, there's 3 or perhaps 4 parts. We're going to look briefly at some details regarding the text and the author of the text. And we'll look at what is fiqh. What is fiqh? 3, since this is particularly directed to those trying to pursue knowledge seriously, that what are some keys to mastery in knowledge, and particularly in the subject here of fiqh. And 4, we're going to look at some key principles related to how fiqh works. So firstly, the author and the text. It's always important to pay attention to some preliminary matters before one jumps into any text. Right? It's important to know who the author is. One should know about the text, so one can place the text and its authorship in a broader context. The author is important because we believe in authority. Right? In the reality that not anyone can speak about the religion. Right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of remembrance. And that's a category of people. And they have characteristics and qualities and ways that they are recognized. And ask the people of remembrance if you know not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers in the Quran to those who have the ability to interpret, had they but returned it to Allah and to His Messenger. وَإِلَى الَّذِينَ يَسْتَنْبِطُونَهُ مِنْهُمْ. And to those who have the ability to derive rulings from amongst them. Okay? And this is very clear in texts from the Prophet ﷺ, that we don't, anyone could acquire that authority. Right? It is not the birthright of anyone, it is acquired. But there are conditions. So it's important to know, who is this author? Is this someone who is of recognized authority in the subject that they're speaking about? If they're not, then even if what they say sounds good, it is not of religious consequence. And one must verify this. And that if someone comes to you who's إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا, if there comes to you someone who is untrustworthy with some news, then confirm. So you first have to confirm, who is the person transmitting? Are they reliable or not reliable? Right? Are they trustworthy or not trustworthy? So authorship is important. And then the text. Right? And the text. That what is this text? What is its purpose? What is its level? Right? So that one knows where it fits in the stages of learning. Where is it with respect to this subject? Because some texts are introductions to a subject, but they're brief. You wouldn't look for a detailed explanation of a nuanced issue in a brief text, and maybe even in its commentary. It's not a reference work, but it may be an introductory work that's reliable. But if you're looking for a basic overview, you would not go to a reference work, because they're based on detail. And there's a way to go about pursuing any subject in terms of graduated study. So the text that we're looking at, called Ascent to Felicity, and thankfully the translator and editor, Shaykh Faraz, the other one, Shaykh Faraz Khan, he didn't give it a rhyming title. Its title in Arabic is Maraqi Sa'adat fi ilmay at-tawheed wal ibadat. Literally, ascent to the two felicities in the two sciences of divine oneness and worship. So it covers two subjects, but we'll be looking at the second part, which is on worship. We'll be looking at who the author is, but this text is less famous than more famous works by the same author, Imam Shurunbulali. Imam Shurunbulali was primarily known as a jurist, as a faqih, as a specialist in Islamic law, and he wrote some very large works in fiqh. Arguably his most significant legal contribution was a work that is famous as Shurunbulaliya, which is a hashia. It's a super commentary on a work called Ad-Durar by Mullah Khusro, who was a very distinguished Ottoman scholar. And that was one of the standard mid-level works in the study of Hanafi fiqh, and it's the Durar of Mullah Khusro, and the standard gloss on it, the standard hashia on it, is that of Imam Shurunbulali. So Mullah Khusro from about the 9th century, Imam Shurunbulali is from the 11th century, and from his time this work was in print. Very interestingly, of course, as an aside, because it was one of the texts, it was considered an Ottoman text. So when Arab nationalism flared up from the late 19th century, and particularly early 20th century, to much detriment to our ummah, even in the Muslim heartland, outside of what's now Turkey, they distanced themselves from classical texts that were considered Ottoman. So early 20th century, a lot of curricula shifted. Many places had parallel curricula. They had their own classical curriculum, like in Damascus and Baghdad and Mosul, etc. But they also had the Ottoman works, and they're often studied in parallel or together. And one of these works was the Durar of Mullah Khusro, on which Imam Shurunbulali wrote a very significant commentary. And that covers all the chapters of fiqh. But the most famous single work of Imam Shurunbulali is Nurul Idah, which focuses on the fiqh of worship, particularly. It's a trick question. People said, I've studied Nurul Idah. Simple question to ask them is, what does it cover? And most of them don't know what chapters it covers. So you didn't even cover it then. Like, you don't know. Like if you don't know what it covers, you probably don't know what's in it, right? So, like they say, ihtarim halak. Yeah, have some self-respect. But Nurul Idah was authored by Imam Shurunbulali, and it's one of the most studied works in the fiqh of worship, but erroneously so, as we'll explain. He authored a very lengthy commentary on the work called Imdadul Fattah, right? The assistance of the grantor of openings. But it's very detailed. It's a big chunky volume. So he was asked that, could you write something a little briefer? So he wrote a briefer work called Maraqi al-Falah. And Maraqi al-Falah. If I have typos, please point them out. Maraqi al-Falah. Which is the ways of ascent, the ways of rising to felicity. And that is the more famous of the two commentaries on Nurul Idah. It's significantly shorter than Nurul Idah. And it's become a common practice in many places that they'll start the study of Hanafi fiqh with this work, Nurul Idah. But that's an error. Because Nurul Idah is one of the core text on which he wrote two commentaries. Nurul Idah is probably the most detailed single work that is well known on the fiqh of worship in the Hanafi school. As he himself mentions, in the beginning he says, هذا مختصر جمعت فيه ما تشتت من مسائل المطولات. This is a summary work in which I have gathered those matters that are spread out in the detailed works on worship. So it is very detailed. If you open it, you'll see. If you go to the sunnahs of prayer, for example, right? If you go to the sunnahs of prayer, it'll tell you some scary things, right? Really scary. It actually, I believe I'm still traumatized by it because it scared the wits out of me. It'll tell you that the sunnahs of prayer are 51. Whoa, that's scary, right? But that's not so difficult, right? The wajib actions of prayer are a stunning number. Okay? They're like 81 or some huge numbers. So there's big numbers. 67 this, 81 this, 57. The conditions of saying Allahu Akbar are 18 or 21. That's scary. Right? So now, if you don't even know what are the conditions of prayer, to hear that there's 18 or 15 or 18 or 21, depending on how you count them, conditions for giving the takbir, that's scary. Okay? And how could you possibly retain all that? So there's a lot of detail. Which is not to say that it's not important, but how do you get to it? Nur al-Idah is written to be a text that once you know the fiqh of worship, you've studied the basics, then you studied the essential details. Then, as a third or perhaps fourth text in the fiqh of worship, you study that, now you know you've covered all the details. But you have a structure on which you build those details. Okay? Because the way, a key to learning is that it is done in stages. Okay? That first one knows the framework of knowledge, of any knowledge. What are the conditions, integrals, key issues, basics. Then one goes into the essential details. And then one looks at the greater details. But that allows one to build. Because if you study a text that's several hundred pages in the fiqh of worship, how much are you going to retain? Only a small subset thereof. That small subset, why not have studied that first? And know it all. Such that then when you cover the details, you can retain them much more easily. So this is why a work like Ascent to Felicity or similar level texts are better studied first. Nur al-Idah was often studied as the first text in a madrasa, like when a student would be 12 or so. But from the age of 7 or 8, they would have started studying a very brief text, which are often called ilmul hal, like what we covered in the Absolute Essentials. Then they may cover a couple of other very brief texts, shurutul salah, the conditions of prayer, this, that, like very small treatises that are ma la budda minhu, necessary knowledge, etc. So you cover a couple of these, maybe one text a year, while they're learning their basic language skills and Quran, etc. So they know just the skeletal details. So that by the time they come to something like Nur al-Idah, they already know the conditions, the integrals, the main sunnahs, etc. And they're ready for a detailed exposition. And for general study, Nur al-Idah has way too much detail. For general study, Nur al-Idah has way too much detail. You can get lost in those details. So someone who studies it without background, you'll get waswasa. 15 conditions for saying the takbir. You tell someone, say Allahu Akbar. Repeat after me, Allahu Akbar. I say, okay, Allahu Akbar. Now to tell someone that you can make the takbir بِكُلِّ ذِكْرٍ خَالِصٍ لِلَّهِ تَعَالَى, you can make the takbir with every dhikr that is purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَا يَشُبُهُ مَعْنَى الطَّلَبِ, does not contain any implication of seeking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that not to make any errors and that is wajib to specify Allahu Akbar. But if you say Allahu Akbar, you have to make sure that you elongate the alif in Allah and say the ha, and not add any alifs in Akbar, and this and this and this and all these different. It's a recipe for confusion and misgivings. So this is why one approaches things with what they call tadarruj, in a gradual and graduated manner. And that's one of the crises of learning in recent times, that people have left. I recently was talking to Shaykh Salih bin Siddina, the Mauritanian scholar, And he said, this is, min afat zaman, from the tribulations of our times, that people have left this way of gradual study. So that's why we're going to be looking at this text. It has the key details, right? So but it's about a third of the size, approximately, of its, of Nur al-Idah by the same author. But Nur al-Idah is a useful text to accompany this. If you want to read along, dip into it, it won't hurt you in any way. And it's written with great clarity. The translation is very good by Shaykh Faraz Khan. Make sure you have a copy. Firdaus Books has copies here. And the footnotes by Shaykh Faraz Khan are excellent. Sharp man, mashallah. Very capable. And the nature of fiqh is that most things are differed upon in their details. Somewhere or the other, there'll be some difference. So we may not always agree on those details, but they're excellent footnotes. Who's the author of the text? And it's important to know any authors for a number of reasons, right? These are inheritors of the Prophet ﷺ. The translation of the text has a good biography of the author. Do read through it, inshallah. His kunya is Abul Ikhlas, literally the father of sincerity. And this was an honorific title. He didn't have a child named Ikhlas, right? But people, he was really distinguished for this quality. People noted both his deep piety and his sincerity. The fuqaha, the scholars of the outward, kept a certain restraint when it came to expressing their spiritual leanings. So they wouldn't talk much about it. Right? Someone once asked one of the great ulama of our times, Shaykh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Buti rahimahullah, that why don't you ever talk about love? Like, you talk about all these heavy topics, these big intellectual, why don't you talk about love? So he has a beautiful work called Min al-Fikri wal-Qalb, right? From the mind, from reflection and the heart. And he has some amazing, and it's meant to be, they're literary writings, but they have great intellectual depth, and also many of them are very moving. So he wrote, لماذا لا أتكلم عن الحب? So he explains why he doesn't talk about love. Maybe anyone can talk about love, and there's big issues to deal with in our times, so he's dealing with the big issues. But then his wife died, and he wrote a couple of really moving pieces on love. And he softened up a little later on, but they keep it, but it comes out every once in a while. And Imam Shurunbulali, as we'll see, you can see, for example, in Nur al-Idah, he talks about, after finishing look at purification, right? He touches a little about turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before beginning prayer. And his name is Hassan ibn Ammar ibn Ali Shurunbulali. And Shurunbulali is referential to his place of birth. It's a town in Egypt, because Shurunbulali or something. I try to be fancy and try to look it up in Google Maps. I didn't know how it's spelled in English, but and he's Al-Hanafi because he was of the Hanafi school. He was Azhari. People would go to Al-Azhar for higher studies. So they'd study in maktabs, in primary schools, in their local, in their local area, and then they would memorize, and they'd memorize the Quran. Those who showed seriousness would also start memorizing the mutun, the basic texts. They'd study the basics till they, by our modern day standards, become ulama. Like they'd study the core text, and then they'd go to study in more depth and study the higher texts in the large cities. And so they'd go to Al-Azhar and study. Sometimes they'd study some of the texts they studied before, but now in more depth, and then study the higher texts. So he moved to Cairo and studied there under some of the very distinguished scholars, and became himself a very distinguished teacher of fiqh primarily, although he's very well rounded, but his focus was fiqh, and was distinguished for his fatwa as well. And he wrote numerous treatises. His collected treatises are in the dozens of treatises on different topics. And he is particularly distinguished for his depth of understanding of fiqh. So they refer to him as Faqihun Nafs. And this is a particular honorific title given very rarely. Right? Faqihun Nafs. Faqihun Nafs literally means someone for whom fiqh has become a personal quality. Okay? Faqihun Nafs. Fiqh has become their temperament. They're temperamentally a faqih. And they say the sign of someone who's temperamentally a faqih, that if you ask them about something, even if they don't know a particular text about the matter, they would, their own inclination regarding the legal issue would correspond to what is correct. Right? And so he's, one of the biographers, I believe it was Al-Muradi, he said that he was min ahsan al-mutaakhirin. He's one of the most distinguished of the late scholars of the Hanafi school. He was born in the year 994 after the Hijrah and died 1069 after the Hijrah. And he's one of the most referenced scholars in the Hanafi school, both for his larger work, which is across the chapters of fiqh, the Shurunbulali, and also in the fiqh of worship, Nur al-Idah, and its commentaries have been both great study texts and they're authoritative in the fiqh of worship. And his title is also, he's Al-Hanafi Al-Wafa'i. And what's Al-Wafa'i? Al-Wafa'i is a nisbah to the Wafa'i branch of the Shadhili Tariqah. Like most of the great scholars, while his scholarly engagement was in one of the outward sciences, in his case in fiqh, he had taken the spiritual path and trodden the spiritual path under its masters, and he was ascribed to the Wafa'i branch from Sidi Ali Wafa and Sidi Muhammad Wafa. And that's one of the great branches of the Shadhili path, which was particularly widespread in Egypt and North Africa and elsewhere as well. And that's one of the keys of opening in knowledge, is the inward states of those who engage in it. The Prophet ﷺ promised in the hadith related by Imam Bayhaqi and others, إِنَّمَا يَحْمِلُ هَذَا الدِّينِ فِي كُلِّ قَرْنٍ عُدُولُهُ. This religion will be born in each age by its most exemplary. And then the hadith details what the ulama do of safeguarding and supporting and defending the truth, etc. But this is a reality. And this is one of the amazing blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this ummah, that the authorities of our religion were exemplary human beings. We know their biographies in detail. If you want to see, look at the biographies of and not to, with all due respect, where respect is due, and to the extent it's due, but look at the biographies of the popes. I mean, it's shocking. It's shocking, right? There's popes who had kids. There's several popes appointed their own children as leaders of the papal army and governors, and they publicly, they're my children. While what they're teaching is that the clergy cannot be married and therefore cannot have children. So this is one of the characteristics of. That's why the Prophet ﷺ referred to them as his inheritors, right? And that's a tremendous blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he taught very extensively, and many of the very distinguished scholars of the next generation were his students. If you look in the biography provided by Shaykh Faraz Khan in his translation, you can see a listing of some of his notable students. So a text like this, it's a reliable text. You will find actually Ascent to Felicity, there's almost nothing there that is not a reliable position in the school. Though in Nur al-Idah, because it has so much more details, there's many derivative rulings, and sometimes there are rulings that are not the relied upon position in the school, though he himself points out that sometimes he chooses a sound opinion, even though another opinion may have been considered more sound in the school. It is rare that a position will be mentioned in Nur al-Idah, although there's a handful of positions that is not reliable in the school, such that it is considered weak and should not be followed. But there, out of several thousand rulings in the text, there's just a small handful. Because that's a test. Like if someone says they've studied Nur al-Idah, that's okay. Could you list some of the rulings that are not reliable in the text? If they don't know, well, don't go around testing people like that. Because if you don't know yourself, like what are you doing testing others? But so he's a very distinguished scholar of the school, and an example of the caution that he himself acquired. He mentions in one of his works that when one of his teachers, if they were asked about a matter, and they gave a ruling, they'd say to the questioner, if you have a moment, I can show it to you from the texts. Usually the questioner, they're just looking for an answer and they want to go. So just one, to give you confidence about what has been said, and number two, to confirm, because every human being is given to error. And that's the sense of caution about deen that such scholars had, and why their knowledge was blessed. So that's just a little bit about the author and the text. So we're covering this text, one, because the author is considered one of the great late authorities in the Hanafi school, someone who really refined the details of the fiqh of worship, particularly in his larger work Nur al-Idah, but here in a very much more concise and clear manner. And so the text does not take a long time to cover, and gives one a very solid foundation to build one understanding. Next, we're just going to look briefly at what is fiqh. So what is fiqh, the term fiqh in the Arabic language? Fiqh is is deep or complete understanding. Right? To know something, right, is to be able to affirm what it is. Right? A is B. Right? But fiqh is to have depth of understanding. It is to have subtle understanding, such that you wouldn't call the obvious knowledge fiqh. So for example, how many daily prayers are there is not a question of fiqh. Because like, is there anything difficult? Like, does anyone not know that it's 5? That's obvious, so it's not fiqh. Right, so, and this of course affects what the fuqaha talk about, because many things are deemed obvious, so they're not stated. And from the obvious things are virtues. They're obvious, it's right there. Like, what more is there to say about it? So that's why you won't get a complete picture unless you know the virtues. They're thought to be obvious. That's why they say, الفقه فهم ما دق من الأمور. Fiqh is understanding the subtleties of matters. And this is important to keep in mind because it's very, in our time, some of the obvious is no longer so obvious. And in studying fiqh, many people harm themselves in understanding and harm others through application. Or just through lack of understanding. Because they don't, they're not able to place fiqh in the broader context of religious guidance. So, to take an example, legally, what is the ruling of a man marrying without the approval of his father? So Zubayr goes and says, I'm going to marry Zubaydah without asking my parents. What's the legally, what's the ruling of that in itself? That's not the answer. What's the ruling of that in itself? It's valid. It is not a condition for a man marrying to have parental approval. There's no hint of that being a requirement. It's not a condition for the marriage, it's not an integral of the marriage. It won't be even listed as a sunnah of marriage, because it's not related to the marriage itself. So it's, the fuqaha, if someone asks, like, what's the ruling of marrying without parental approval for the man? They look at you as if you're descended from grapefruit or something. Like, what's wrong with you? You're not speaking with the language of the fuqaha. Like, where do you come from? And the fuqaha take offense very easily, right? Because they hope for intelligence. Although they tend to be bitter because intelligence can't be assumed of rational animals, right? So it's perfectly permissible. You'll find nothing else in the books of fiqh. They won't even talk about it because it's like a non-issue. But what is, if someone does it, if a man marries without seeking approval of their parents, what would be the ruling of doing so? Let's do the raise the hand thing. Sinful. Why? It's not a condition, it's not an integral, it's not an obligation, it's not even listed as a sunnah of marriage. Why is it sinful? Where do you get that from? Just for the sake of being, like, there's a reason. Say it. Yeah. So, in itself, parental approval has nothing to do with the validity and soundness of the marriage itself. So it's unrelated to the issue in of itself. What they say in Arabic, في حد ذاته, in itself. But in applying a ruling, what does one have to look at? The related considerations, the related consequences. And getting married without parental approval would inevitably, even for a man, would be, what would it cause typically if you don't seek parental approval and get married? Yeah, it would be from disrespecting your parents, from causing them grief, from risking the breaking of family ties. So we'd say, if you could say about getting a man getting married without parental approval that it is permissible, but you can also say about it that it's a major sin. Right? Because in applying a ruling, you have to understand secondary, you have to understand the context of application and what are the directly related consequences. So this is part of fiqh, but it's considered obvious. Similarly, fiqh is to understand the subtleties of religious matters. But if you don't know the obvious regarding those matters, then you don't know why the fuqaha are saying what they're saying, which is why one needs to know what the primary texts are related to the matter, especially as one goes in more detail. Because they won't spell it out for you, because it's considered obvious. So in trade, for example, they'll say that such and such thing is corrupts a sale because it leads to dispute. What's the big deal about dispute? Because dispute vitiates the condition mentioned in the Quran regarding permissible trade. إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَن تَرَاضٍ مِنْكُمْ, except that it be through trade on the basis of mutual agreement. An entire commentary may not mention the central verse regarding trade in the section on trade. Why? It's obvious. Are you a Muslim? Yes. Do you believe in the Quran? Yes. Do you follow the Prophet ﷺ? Yes. Do you not apply his words? Recite the Quran each month. If you did, you'd know it. Okay? So it's considered obvious. So this is why it's important to have that broader sense of the religious context. There is proper manners, considerations with respect to others, right? That if not upheld, your knowledge could be a means of harm rather than benefit. So the root meaning of fiqh is to know with understanding. It's to have awareness of, is to have deep understanding of the subtleties of things. فهم ما دق من الأمور. This is why fiqh entails action for it to be true. Imam al-Bazdawi, one of the great scholars of usul al-fiqh, he mentions in his work on usul that it is understood from the definition, from the linguistic sense of fiqh, that it is not just to know, but to act in accordance with that knowledge. Because you can't say that you understand that fire burns if you stick your finger in it. You know that fire burns, okay, but you didn't really understand the implications of it, so you stuck your hands in it. But fiqh is deep understanding. You don't have deep understanding unless you act in accordance with what you understand. Right? And he uses some references from the Arabic, from classical Arabic, to confirm that. Right? So you can translate it really as religious understanding. Right? Understanding rather than just knowledge, right? Imam Abu Hanifa was asked, what is fiqh? And he gave one of the truly brilliant definitions. He said, Al-fiqhu ma'rifatu nafs, ma laha wa ma alayha. Fiqh is to know oneself. Fiqh, religious understanding, is to know yourself. Is to know oneself, what is for it and against it. To know yourself, to know who are you. You are a servant of God. What is your responsibility? It is to believe in your Lord, to submit to Him in accordance with what He has commanded in the way that is pleasing to Him, in the way that is acceptable to Him and pleasing to Him. To know yourself. What is for you and what is against you in this life and in the next, by the standard that matters, which is the divine standard. Right? And that's what is fiqh? It is establishing the divine standard. Fiqh is about knowing what does Allah seek from His servants. It's used in the sense of deep understanding in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Right? And it is this understanding, this self-awareness, that is being referred to in the hadith mentioning the virtues of fiqh. مَنْ يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. Whomever Allah wishes well for, He grants deep knowledge of religion. Okay? It is not He makes them into a jurist. Okay? It's in this broader sense. And there's a beautiful discussion of this in the Book of Knowledge by Imam al-Ghazali. And Imam al-Ghazali distills what's mentioned regarding fiqh in the Quran and the Sunnah, that fiqh is ma'rifatu tariq al-akhirah. Fiqh is to know the path of the hereafter. Right? Know the path of the hereafter. وَابْتَغِ بِمَا أَتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةِ. Seek with all that God has granted you the next abode. وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. But yet do not forget your share of this life. Fiqh is to put first things first, to put Allah first, to put His command before one's whims, to put His pleasure above one's inclinations. And then there's the formal usage of fiqh as a science and a subject that is studied. And this is, it's not a changing of the usage, right? It is a particular application of the term, because at the end of the day, what is our responsibility before Allah? What is our responsibility before Allah? وَقَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. They say we hear and we obey. Right? What is entailed by belief? Right? Like the closing verse of Surah Al-Baqarah. آمن الرسول بما أنزل إليه من ربه والمؤمنون. The messenger believes in that which was revealed to him from his Lord, as do the believers. Each believe, and the integrals of faith are mentioned. Then say, وَقَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. What's entailed by belief is submission. But what is submission? Is to hear, right, which is through knowledge, and the means of knowledge is hearing. وَأَطَعْنَا, and we obey. Right? Guidance, as Imam al-Ghazali mentions in the beginning of guidance, is two levels. The first is obedience. Right? And then it is doing what is virtuous. The Hadith Qudsi, my servant draws close to me by nothing more beloved to me than what I have made obligatory upon them. And my servant continues to draw close to me by supererogatory acts until I love them. How do you know what is obligatory upon you? Of actions, it is fiqh. Okay? What is praiseworthy? It is fiqh. Okay? And what is confusing about them? But fiqh focuses on the outward acts. Fiqh as a subject focuses on the outward acts. Though actions have more than one aspect. There's the outward aspect of the actions, that's what fiqh looks at. There's the inward aspect of the actions, of their of sincerity and inward excellence, of consciousness of Allah and presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the inward qualities of actions. And that's for the purpose of clarity, they separated these into distinct sciences, because each requires its own considerations. But that's also from fiqh. That's also from fiqh. Right? That's why some of the ulama refer to it as fiqh al-batin, or fiqh al-qalb. It is the inward fiqh, or the fiqh of the heart. But fiqh focuses on the outward aspect of the actions. And then there are next worldly consequences to the actions. Reward and punishment, and the specifics of the rewards, etc. But those are obvious, because those aren't matter of fiqh. That's only established by what? By transmission. It's mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. Whoever prays Salatul Duha, this is the reward. Whoever regularly prays the Sunnah prayers, this is the reward. What's the fiqh in that? Is there any fiqh in that? Is there anything subtle about it? So you could look at the knowledge related to human actions has four aspects to it. There's the outward and the inward, the worldly and next worldly. So there's four considerations, right? There's knowledge of the outward actions and their worldly consequences and their next worldly consequences. And there's knowledge of the inward with respect to the actions and the worldly consequences of that and the next worldly consequences of that. So there's four considerations. What does fiqh look at as a science? It only looks at how many of the four? One. Fiqh only looks at the outward action insofar as its worldly consequences. Because the next worldly consequences are obvious. Like, if you obey, there's reward. Either in general or specific, like that's established by transmission. Like they say there's no fiqh to that. It's obvious. Right? Right? And of course, in the next world, there's an outward and an inward. Right? The outward is the reward. The inward is, or the subtle. That there's a tangible, intangible. The subtle is the good pleasure of Allah, the closeness of Allah, the love of Allah, the beholding of Allah, etc. Right? So, fiqh won't talk about next worldly matters. Nor will it talk about the inward. But the fuqaha will say without the outward, nothing else remains. Okay? And the outward is very important. Sayyidi Abdul Qadir al-Jailani, Qaddasallahu sirrah, he refers to it, is that the outward is like the treasure chest, which if you don't have one, the treasure won't remain. Now you try to gather a whole bunch of gold, but you just leave it there. It's not going to stay. Right? You get in the old days, they especially because people, things like to have things that reminded them of love, they would have songbirds. Right? Because it would remind them of the yearning of the lover. Because they said the songbird sings in yearning. أما ترى الطير المقفص يا فتى. Okay? Do you not see the caged songbird, O young one? Right? يغرد بالتفريد لما بفؤاده فتضطرب الأعضاء في الحس والمعنى. Okay? It sings sweet songs to express what is within its heart. So its limbs shake as its heart has been shaken. Right? And it says it breaks out in song when it remembers its homeland. But if you get a songbird but you don't put it in a cage, it's going to fly away. Okay? And that's what happens to a lot of people with religiosity. They don't pay attention to the forms of the sunnah, so those meanings don't last. Okay? So the fuqaha would say this is, the fuqaha are the guardians of, they'd say we're the guardians of the galaxy of moral responsibility. Right? Right? The other people say like, khaffif, calm down. And they say it's the only science worth studying. But that's of course a bit of an exaggeration. But it's very important. And also because our deen has come to regulate not only our relationship with God, and that's obvious. Anyone who begins caring about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would start with worship. But that's not all that Allah has commanded us with. Because our obligation to submit to Allah relates to every aspect of our life. Which is why in complete works of fiqh, the section on worship typically takes a quarter or less of the book. Right? There's all kinds of, and with respect to the soundness and health of human relationships, the preservation of the rights of others, the regulation of public good, the prevention of societal injustice and wrongdoing and harm and crime. This requires fiqh. Of course, that fiqh has to be in the context of the akhlaq and adab, etc., without which it can become just outward formalism, but the forms safeguard meanings. They say, لولا الأواني لما ظهرت المعاني. Were not for the containers, the meanings would not be manifest. لولا الأواني. Were not for the containers, the meanings that are found within would not be. You can only find sincerity if there's an action in which you are sincere. You can only find love through its expressions. There's no meaning to reliance upon Allah except something in which you are through the means of expression of that reliance. Say, I have awe of Allah, but you don't do what He's commanded. What kind of awe is that? Okay. So there's a context to the fiqh, but it's not to denigrate its importance, but to show that fiqh, for it to be of benefit, needs to be connected with consciousness of the inward dimensions of those outward rulings, and also awareness that these have next worldly consequence. Why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? So who is a person of fiqh? Right? Who is a person of fiqh? there's a reality to that fiqh. Right? There's a reality to that fiqh. Right? A person of fiqh is the one who knows the outward rulings, so that they're outwardly in a state of submission to Allah. And they're able to convey how to submit to others. None of you believes until they wish for others the good that they wish for themselves. But it is also a person whose own state, inwardly, is in submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they have the requisite inward knowledge, the key characteristics of which are sincerity, ikhlas, taqwa, mindfulness or piety, khashya, awe, okay, and the other praiseworthy states of the heart, gratitude, love, and so on. And who has a keen consciousness of the hereafter. Because every ruling has the consequence of any ruling is not its worldly implications, but its next worldly implications. وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. The next life is better for you than this life. So that's part of the reality. And here it's important, inshallah we'll share this as a resource. Imam al-Ghazali talks about the signs of the scholars of the hereafter. In the book of knowledge, and that's worth reading and reflecting upon. A number of scholars encourage their students to memorize that section, at least to know the 10 signs of the scholars of the hereafter. And that's a standard that one should strive to hold oneself to. And also from the Ihya, Imam al-Ghazali talks at length about who are those who are firm-footed in knowledge. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises in the Quran, وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ, those firm-footed in knowledge. And we covered that in a class here at the Hub, and we'll have that as a supplementary recording to this class, because it's an important thing to be clear about what the purpose of this knowledge is. And the ulama mention that everything that has come with respect to the virtue of knowledge applies to the one who seeks it with sincerity and who acts upon it as entailed by that knowledge. Right? The virtue of knowledge is great, but it is conditional and extrinsic. Right? Conditional upon sincerity and sought because of the consequent action, both inward and outward. But there's also, who's a person of fiqh, there's also a formal aspect of fiqh. Right? That one of the most important of knowledge that people need in their day-to-day life is just how to do things right. To make their actions accord to the divine command. Right? And this is, and the person who knows that, firstly for their own self, so that they can act in accordance with the divine command and act with virtue, with excellence, in accordance with the sunnah. But one who's able to convey that is of the most important knowledge. That's of the most important knowledge. So, who's a person of fiqh? Formally, in terms of the science of fiqh, is the one who has mastery of the legal details. They understand the subtleties and nuances of things. Right? So, they're not the person who can give you a khutbah about prayer, that prayer is very virtuous and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, seek assistance and patience in prayer. The Prophet ﷺ said that prayer purifies you like, anyone could open Riyadh al-Salihin and read the virtues of prayer. Fiqh is to know, okay, I prayed without my pajamas on, what happened to my prayer, to my Fajr prayer? I only prostrated once in the first rak'ah of my witr prayer, what should I have done? I did, all the different things that can happen in one's actions and to one's actions, mission or commission. So it's to know, the legal details, to understand them, and to be able to apply them. Right? That is a person of fiqh. Right? And of course, it's a sign of, lack of people's, or of a lack of concern that people don't have questions about their fiqh. Partly because they're not trying to apply divine guidance to their lives. They live without having a will. They're not worried about their inheritance. They don't care about the halal and haram related to their work. They don't check if their contracts are sound. They start a business and they just ask, are we allowed to start a business in such and such matter? But they don't know if their employment contracts are permissible. They don't know if their ways of financing are. So it's investment. Yeah, but investment has its principles. Right? They don't know if the way they are renting is permissible, hiring and leasing, all kinds of different things. So this is something that a person of fiqh knows, does not approach anything without knowing with clarity what is the command of Allah regarding this matter. And a person of concern would know not only the command of Allah regarding what they're going to do, but what are the likely contingencies or the reasonably potential contingencies, and what if certain things happen? What would you do in that circumstance? So there are practically some keys to mastery of fiqh. And very simply, and this is to reiterate something that we've mentioned, but it's the ulama say there's three things you do. If you keep doing them, you'll gain a lot of knowledge, and you'll be able to build on that knowledge and benefit through that knowledge. There's three outward means. Right? They say it's at-tahdiru wal-isgha'u wal-muraja'a. Right? It is to prepare before class. To attend, that's the first. The second, to attend attentively. And the third is to review actively. Well, that's it. And then keep going. Right? Just keep going. There's three inward means, right, of benefiting from that knowledge. One is to always be nurturing one's sincerity and concern. Right? And these are expressed, all three are expressed in one's intention. One's sincerity. Why are you seeking knowledge? For the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Seeking Allah through it. What is the concern in it? Right? To be in a state of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to submit with excellence. Right? Right? To attain the love and closeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And to have a sense of purpose and urgency in that seeking. Right? That what are you trying to achieve through seeking that knowledge? For yourself and for others. Because وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ قَوْلًا مِمَّنْ دَعَا إِلَى اللَّهِ. Who is better than in expression than one who calls to Allah, وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا, and does righteous deeds, وَقَالَ إِنَّنِي مِنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, who affirms that I am truly of those who submit. And in that pursuit of knowledge, that one seeks the knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That you are responsible for taking the means with excellence. But the giver is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? The giver is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just some practical things. How should one prepare for a class? If that's one of the keys to benefit, right? We're not here, for edutainment, for educational entertainment. Oh wow, Imam Shurunbulali was born at the end of the 10th century. No kidding, you should have opened the book and seen that yourself, right? He was Egyptian. Oh wow, like it's not, and you can tell, like you mentioned something that's obvious, it's right there in the text. And people are like, and it's like, come on, like, be on the same page, right? So, how do you prepare for class? There's 4 things that are obvious, but they're rarely done. One is read the upcoming section. Read the upcoming section. At least once, right? So you know what's going on, right? Like, especially when one goes into deep knowledge, they say the person who comes unprepared for class is like, it's like مثل الأطرش في الزفة. It's like the deaf person in the wedding party. There's all this stuff going on, and they don't know why is everyone like jumping up and down, right? It's a wedding party. Similarly, you're discussing something subtle, but someone comes unprepared, or they say it's like the person who goes to battle without weapons. So we have an appointment at such and such place. You showed up, but it's a battle. Right? You have to have your weapons there. So read the upcoming section. The least is just to read it, but they say proper reading of something would entail doing a quick reading to get an idea what's being covered, then to do a more thorough reading to understand what's being covered, and in the second reading also to understand what one doesn't understand. Right? Which would then translate into questions that you have. And then to read it a third time to gain further clarity. Take notes. Right? Most people take notes when they come to class. But the subject matter itself, you should take notes before the class. Like if a text is being covered, why is there a text? Why aren't we just lecturing off the top? Because the text gives you a framework for what's being covered. So take notes on the text itself beforehand. Right? So you have a framework around which to take the notes. And that helps with greater attention. Because the things that are already in the text, you're not taking notes about those, because that's already in the text. And you're prepared for that. It helps to try to diagram things, if there's a definition. Right? Something's broken down. So there's 4 obligatory acts of wudu. You break it down into 4. And say, okay, how could you diagram it? Well, 3 of them, you could diagram it in a step-by-step. 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. But there's also 3 have to do with washing and 1 has to do with wiping. So you could do it in more than one way. Okay. Whoa. So this is, sorry, just give me a second. Sorry. So you take notes, right? And it doesn't take long. You don't have to take detailed notes, right? Even if you take brief notes, right? But so you take notes, try to diagram, and if the more preparation before a class is a form of investment, right? And the return that you get from the class is to the extent of the investment. For people who are serious students of knowledge, the ulama used to say, read a section 5 times before you come to a class. So you have deep knowledge of it. And what one aspires to, right, is that you should come to the class knowing the class already. Right? That you should come to the class knowing that the topic that's being covered, as well as the teacher, except that the teacher has the experience and and the depth and background in the subject, etc., that you may lack. Right? Right? So you're trying to gain what is not already there. Right? That's fiqh. Right? And tafaqquh is not gaining the obvious. You went to a class on wudu and said, oh, there's 4 obligatory acts of wudu. That's what I learned today. That's there in the text. You could have learned that at home. Right? But the nuances, the subtleties that I mentioned, they flew past you because you hadn't invested. So it's the least, is to come to prepare to class that you know everything that you could know before coming to the class. Higher than that is to come knowing the text as well as the teacher. And there are those who would go to class knowing the subject better than the teacher, except that the teacher has their degree of authority and depth of understanding, etc. I've seen that. There's people. One of the Western students, one of the scholars in the U.S. We hope to invite him to the hub one day. I won't mention his name. When he used to ask Shaykh Adib certain questions, Shaykh Adib would say, Shaykh Adib would refer to the student as Shaykh. Say, yeah, Shaykh, like, why do you ask me these questions? You know this stuff better than I do. And he meant it. Of course, Shaykh Adib had the experience, the authority, and this, but because the person would put in, for each half-hour class, he'd put in 5-6 hours. Right? But that's the seriousness. To prepare one's questions, right? To write down one's questions. What is it that you don't understand? To think about the questions. Okay? And to do the related readings, particularly the directed related readings. Like we're mentioning, there's certain things that are of benefit to read, and we'll mention some specifically related to this text. Right? And that's how the people who gain knowledge. It's mentioned regarding Imam al-Juwayni, the teacher of Imam al-Ghazali, that by the time he completed his first text in Usul al-Fiqh, which is one of the sciences that he was most famous for, he'd studied 200 texts himself during the study during his study of that text. Imam al-Jurjani, by the time he went Imam al-Taftazani, by the time he went to study one of the great texts in logic under the author of a commentary on it, he'd read the whole text 14 times before going to class. And that'd be one of the established practice of the scholars, that before studying a subject, they'd consult, what should I read about it? And they'd read 1 or 2 books through directed reading, not just whatever they felt like reading, before attending a class on the subject. But that's high in the aspiration. But one should go, at least read the upcoming section, take some notes, prepare your questions. If there's related readings, do them. Then how do you review? Right? How do you review? Yeah. One is, after a class, review immediately. Review immediately. Right? If you can do it before leaving, that's not a bad practice. Before you leave, review what you've covered. Or at least before you go to sleep, because it helps significantly with retention. Because you just covered it, it's fresh in your mind, but it'll flee. So go back, look over what you covered, even if you do it very quickly, even if it takes 5-10 minutes, just review the class that you've just taken without undue delay. If you can do it immediately, that's good. If you can't, then before you go to sleep, do that. And then review the subject that you're covering, the text that you're covering, periodically. Have routines of reviewing everything that you've covered in the subject. Have ways of testing yourself. Right? Have ways of testing yourself. That's part of active review. So for example, you're reviewing purification. Don't just read over your notes like it's a novel. Say, I kind of know it. This happened and that happened. And there's tayammum, and you can tell it like a story. But rather, okay, tayammum, it says, okay, there's conditions for tayammum. There's integrals of tayammum. There's things that nullify tayammum. So you say, okay, in this chapter, what are the main areas that are covered? And test yourself. So what are the conditions of tayammum? Okay. And that your knowledge is to know that which is knowable. Al-ilmu ma'rifatul ma'lum. Knowledge is to know what is, to know the known, basically, right? And nothing else is knowledge, right? And so you test yourself, right? And you don't grade yourself. There's only one level with respect to knowledge. Either know it or you don't. Simple. I have 70% knowledge of tayammum. So what are you going to do? Like, do a 3/4 valid tayammum? Like, it doesn't work that way, right? I kind of follow the sunnah, sort of. No, you either follow it, and have a study companion, right? Have a study companion, right? Because knowledge through group study sticks much better than it does on one's own. And it encourages one, it gives one a sense of responsibility, accountability, and this is an important practice. And they say that in reviewing, there's certain things to focus on. And this applies not just to reviewing, it applies to preparation, attending attentively in class. And so like what kinds of things you focus on? I won't try to number these. There's a few. One is definitions are really important. Anything you don't understand, take it back to its definitions. A student who asks questions without having defined terms, that's not a student of knowledge, right? Like, because definitions are known. So you build on the basis of definitions, right? So catch definitions. And that's why, inshallah, in step 2, we study logic because it's important. Because Imam al-Ghazali said, لا ثقة بعلم من لا يعرف المنطق. One cannot trust the knowledge of one who does not know logic. Because they're just speaking like in random ways. Also, to know key concepts. The third is to know what are the most important issues. Like why do we study tayammum? Like just for the barakah of doing it? How many people here have ever made tayammum in their life? Ever, like out of obligation, like they had to? No, none of the sisters? You've never made tayammum? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve you in health and comfort. There's a number of brothers who have, right? What if you get sick? What if you're hospitalized? What if a family member is hospitalized? What if you're on the plane and there's a long queue to use the washroom? What if the washrooms are out of water? And there's all kinds of possibilities. So one should know what are the most important issues. To know what are complex issues so you can give them the due time. What are the complex important issues? So that you can because some understanding takes time. So you give it its due so you understand it clearly. There's things that are complicated. Shaykh Talal said growing up he always thought he was smart until he reached a chapter on menstruation in fiqh. And he was young. And he went to his teacher. He says, Shaykh, I don't understand the chapter on menstruation. The Shaykh said, my son, don't worry, I don't understand it either. Right? And they say, like one of the texts in Shafi'i fiqh, the Nihayat al-Tadrib, it says, حيض نفاس واستحاضة وفهمها يحتاج للرياضة. Right? And then they reach the section on menstruation, postnatal bleeding, and chronic discharge. It says, and understanding them requires riyada. What's riyada? requires training. It requires practice. Right? It requires exercise. Yep. Right? So you have to know what are the key, what are the complex issues, so you can give them their due. You can't understand the fiqh of menstruation just like that. Okay, this is what happens and deal with it. But one needs to know it, right? One needs to know it, right? In Islam, basically, if women want to be obedient to Allah, they have to be literate, at least religiously literate, because you can't just wing menstruation. It's like you have to understand it. So you need to study. Also, to know examples of things. A sign that you understand something, you can give an example. And one of the ways of trying to understand something is to make up an example. And as weird as some of the examples may sound, we try to give examples in class, Zubayr and Zubaydah, this, that, is because it's, an example illustrates something. So make an example. You want to understand, okay, the fiqh related to traveling, it's abstract. Say, okay, Zubayr went to Zubaydah's town to visit her. Okay, was it traveling distance? Okay, he went from here to here. Was it? So you break it down into an example, and it'll clarify things. Right? So look for examples. The examples given. Make up examples yourself. What are the applications of this? Like, you cover some tayammum. Does it have practical application? In the beginning of the text, Imam Shurunbulali will talk about the types of water. Why does he talk about the types of water? What are the applications? Okay, what are the applications? And some things don't, their applications in our time may be distinct, but it's something to be aware of. So this is some of the things to focus on as one goes through fiqh. Any questions here? Go ahead.
Faraz, can you please repeat that definition of fiqh where that began al-ilm al-ahkam al-amaliyya?
Yeah.
Translate it, please.
Yeah. Fiqh is defined like formally as al-ilmu bil-ahkam al-amaliyya al-muktasaba min adillatiha al-tafsiliyya. Fiqh is the knowledge of the rulings related to human actions as derived from the primary legal sources. The primary legal sources being the Quran, the Sunnah, analogy and consensus, and the derivative legal sources. So, just very briefly, some characteristics of Hanafi fiqh. And these will come out in detail as we cover fiqh, but just to have a certain sense of it, the Hanafi school is known as Madhab al-Fuqaha, right? The school of the jurists, because their focus was interpretive. Is how do you interpret revelation? And how do you apply that revelation? The scholars of hadith, their focus was, what does revelation say? Right? Well, this is revelation, this is what it says, act upon it. But the question Abu Hanifa was concerned about is, how do you understand it, and how do you go about applying that revelation to what? To both context and to contingencies, to new matters. Especially, he saw a lot of change was beginning to happen in the world. How are we going to deal with all these changing circumstances? So he used to make up. One of the ways that he taught fiqh was through case studies. What if this happens? What if you take a grape, stick a thread into it, and swallow the grape? Does that break your fast? Well, that's superfluous. But it's not. You go to get many different kinds of testing, they put one of those little cameras into you. Does it break your fast? Well, there's a number of considerations. And Abu Hanifa had his students discuss this, and this is one of the ways that he taught. And at the end of it, and sometimes he wouldn't voice his opinion. Just, they start with the outer circle, right, of the junior students, then the more senior students, and the senior most students would be sitting, the most distinguished students would be sitting closest to him, and then they'd speak. That's why usually we have transmission of a few opinions in the Hanafi school to the senior most students, because those who came before, their opinions were already debated and either accepted or rejected till it reached there. And so the answer, of course, there is, if anything of the grape remains within, it breaks the fast. But if it comes out as it went in, and it was still connected to the outside, it doesn't break the fast. And that's why he said, رَفَعْتُ التَّعْبَ عَنْ أَصْحَابِي, I have lifted toil from my companions. Abu Hanifa dealt with all kinds of course, the hadith scholars were freaked out by that. What's this got to do with it? Deen is sami'na wa ta'na, we hear and we obey. Abu Hanifa said, yes, we hear and we obey if you understand what you heard. Right? So this is the tension. So the focus of the school is on understanding and application of revelation. Whereas the focus of the way of the hadith scholars was to transmit and act on revelation. And there's a tension. The hadith scholars were worried about the jurists that's a little too much opinion there, sir. And the jurists would look at the hadith scholars, they said, لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ قَوْلًا. It's as if they don't understand anything that you say to them. Right? And that's a healthy tension in Islam. And of course there's a lot deep mutual respect. Not to exaggerate the matter, but there were hadith scholars that were freaked out by the way of the jurists. And a second characteristic of the Hanafi school is that Imam Abu Hanifa gave precedence to the decisive texts over the non-decisive texts. That they're not at the same level, whether in transmission or in the meaning that's indicated. And that you understand the non-decisive in light of the decisive. And we'll see many examples of that when it comes to the fiqh that we study. So there's only 4 obligatory acts of wudu. Why? Because that's what's understood from the Quranic verse, and it's considered to be decisive. Other things that are established with regards to wudu, that they're from the prophetic practice, etc. How do you understand it in light of the decisive verse? You say, well, they're encouraged to do, but they don't establish obligation. Whereas the Shafi'is, for example, consider the decisive and non-decisive, practically, both are established, so they're both of legislative consequence. Another example being that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply commands us to make ruku'. That's decisive. And it would appear that if you do ruku', you fulfill the divine command. The sunnah establishes that you remain motionless and this and that. That's understood to be necessary but not obligatory. Because you understand the non-decisive in light of the decisive. Another characteristic of the Hanafi school is that you understand the specifics in light of general principles. That what's generally established is considered as if it's decisive. So a specific matter would not make an exception. Right? So for example, a general principle being that, we'll see early on, to give an upcoming example, that conditions, we see across the chapters of fiqh, that conditions need to be met, they don't need to be sought. العبرة في الشروط حصولها لا تحصيلها. In witnesses, the witnesses in marriage, you just have to fulfill the condition. You don't have to intend it or seek it out. You don't stand for prayer, say, intending that my nakedness is clothed and intending this and no, as long as it's met, That's sufficient. So then if a specific matter comes, you understand it in light of that. Right? Is intention required in wudu? No, because wudu is a condition. As long as it happens, it has to be met. It doesn't necessarily have to be sought. Whereas the more, the hadith scholar would say, where is the specific text about that? Right? So, and the jurists would say, well, it's a meaning that's understood. And then one of the distinguishing qualities of actually Imam Abu Hanifa, particularly even above his students, particularly his secondary students, is what is the principle of istihsan, of legal preference, which is that Imam Abu Hanifa would take into account secondary considerations in his legal analysis. Not just the direct texts related to a matter and the direct consideration, but also secondary matters. And this is what's called istihsan, legal preference. That sometimes an obvious line of reasoning would be left for a less obvious line of reasoning because of preponderating considerations. So we'll see an example when we look at the different types of leftover water. The general principle that's understood from the Quran and the Sunnah, that the saliva of an animal takes the ruling of its flesh. So the saliva of an animal that is not edible, its saliva would be najis, would be filthy. But now a problem arises. What about wild birds? What if they come and drink from water? Does that water become filthy? The primary line of reasoning, legal reasoning, would entail yes. Because if they drink, the saliva reaches the water, it's filthy. Just like if a dog drinks from a small pool of water, the water will become filthy. Because the dog's not edible, the eagle's not edible. But now it's easy to avoid animals drinking from water, but stopping birds from drinking from your small pool of water is a lot more difficult. So a less obvious line of reasoning is to distinguish that, do birds drink differently from animals? And say yes. Because what do birds drink with? The birds drink with their beaks. Dogs, wild animals, typically lap up the water with their tongues. The tongue, it has saliva on it, and you can't deny that. Right? But the bird, can you be sure that its saliva has reached the water? No. So it'd be better to avoid, but it doesn't render it filthy. And that's a simple example of legal preference. Right? And we'll see many examples. So these are some basic distinguishing characteristics of the Hanafi school. A lot of these are much more manifest outside the chapters of worship, but also in the chapters of worship they come up, and we'll be going back to these extensively. Next class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we'll begin with purification and wudu. So do the things suggested, read ahead, try to take your notes, etc. And do read on the virtues of wudu from Riyadh al-Salihin, and on the course page we'll provide that, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And also read on the inner dimensions of purification from Imam Ghazali. And Imam Ghazali has a whole book in the Ihya on Asrar al-Tahara, on the spiritual meanings of purification. But just to begin with, his introduction to the purpose of purification, etc. And we'll look at that briefly next class, but something to read up on. And Imam al-Ghazali covers a lot of beautiful things although the specific fiqh in it is Shafi'i fiqh, but there's many issues that he discusses there that are of great benefit. And some things that the fuqaha don't generally cover extensively, such as he covers the 10 adab related to cleanliness, which relate to the khisalul fitra. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned the practices of naturally keeping oneself clean relate to 10 matters, and that's that's very practical knowledge. So inshallah, these are things to do for the next class. Before we stop and break, any questions here? Yeah, the inner dimensions of purification. It's translated into English. Inshallah, we'll make. It's translated into English. It's an old translation of it. It's not the greatest translation, but it's around.
When we're reading the text and looking for definitions and key concepts, capturing those, are there specific things you'd recommend we look for to distinguish between when something is a definition and something is a concept?
No, a concept would be, like in purification, a concept would be to know that there's this concept of ritual impurity, and there's major ritual impurity and minor ritual impurity. A concept is that there is the distinction between ritual impurity and physical impurity, which is filth. Ritual impurity is that which requires wudu if it's lesser ritual impurity, or that which requires ghusl if it's major ritual impurity. Tangible impurity is filth, which and then so that's a concept, and and concepts are understood through definitions. But then a definition could be like what is fard, what's what. But concepts, to know that there's there's levels of sunnah, emphasized and recommended, etc. A concept to be able to distinguish between what's fard and what's wajib, etc. A concept that, okay, tayammum, what is the basis of tayammum being required? There's one underlying concept. If you don't find water, so it's not finding the ability, actual or effective, to use water. Right? And what's actual inability? There is no water, or you're too far from it. Effective inability, that you're sick or afraid, etc., as we'll see. So those are concepts. The definition of what is tayammum. Tayammum is this. Go ahead. Yeah, how should one review absolute essentials? One of the things to do is, as you cover Ascent to Felicity, take notes from Ascent to Felicity onto absolute essentials. Right? It's like you write, don't go publishing it or anything, like you make your own commentary from the more detailed work on the less detailed work. But look at, okay, what are the most important details that are mentioned in Ascent to Felicity and its footnotes or in the class that you could add to your notes there? Points of interest, right? Points of benefit, right? Without going to too many details, right? Yeah, so if one's reading a complementary text, and that's one is to know that the reading of a text is not a devotional act. It's not a devotional act. I mean, the text that you're studying, it's almost like a devotional act, because you're studying that text. Any text you study, you should know. I mean, that's it, right? But other related readings that you're doing, it's not a devotional act. The devotional act is reading Quran. Right? The devotional act is making dua, dhikr. The related text, you're reading for the benefit that you're seeking in that study. Right? So if you're studying Ascent to Felicity, don't just read passively Nur al-Idah with it. As you prepare for Ascent to Felicity, dip into the supporting, the related reading for what you need. So you want to understand, okay, there are 4 integrals of wudu. So you look there, you may find it defines an integral is this, an obligatory act is, or it says there are 4 obligatory acts and no necessary acts in wudu. That's a useful detail. It may give you some definition, etc. It goes into a lengthy detail about something that's not mentioned in Ascent to Felicity. You can just skip over it. Or at least put an asterisk that maybe go back and read this later. Okay. So, a text at a similar level to Ascent to Felicity that's published in English is a work called Ta'limul Haqq, which is got quite a lot of detail, and it's useful. A text that has a lot more detail than this is Nur al-Idah, which is translated into English. It's useful, and there's particular places we'll encourage you to read that section because it doesn't hurt. We have a translation of Maraqi al-Falah that we will provide in the class forum, in the course forum as well. That's useful to dip into. You want to look at some of the reasoning, whatever, but it's not necessary to read the whole thing or anything like that. The footnotes are very useful. Shaykh Faraz Khan's footnotes are very, very well thought out and carefully put together. Go ahead.
In Ascent to Felicity, besides the Aqidah section, are there any other sections in the book that won't be looked at, or rather not looked at in much detail?
No, we're going to cover the section on worship. We're going to cover it completely, inshallah. There's fiqh related to slaughtering that's mentioned there as well, because slaughtering is one of the things that comes up with Hajj, right? Because you slaughter during Hajj and after Hajj, right? So it often the rulings of that come up as well. Any other questions?
For the text of Maraqi al-Sa'adah, will you be reading it in Arabic and talking to about it in English, or are we going to stick to the English?
No, we're going to read from the Arabic. Like we're going to read the Arabic and translate. But have a copy of the text. Inshallah, in the class forum, we also have the PDF of the Arabic, which is very useful. If you're trying to learn Arabic, Arabic won't come by. Arabic will not be revealed to you one day. The angel Jibreel is not going to come down to you and say, "Iqra." And what do I read? Said, read Arabic. And then suddenly, the meanings of the language of the Arabs will be in your heart. It ain't happening that way. Okay? إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. Knowledge is only through study. And the one who wants something starts taking steps towards it. And it may be a long journey, it may be short, that's not up to you. But you take the steps. So if you're studying something, write it out in Arabic. It's not, because if to learn Arabic, you have to be able to write in Arabic. How will you learn how to write in Arabic? By writing. You won't suddenly wake up and say, oh wow, I can write. It's possible. It is possible. But it's not the common means. And actually most, barakah, divine assistance and facilitation happens upon effort. Right? Or to one who's already directing themselves towards the good. Right? That's why it's called the secret of increase. But there has to be some capital there. So write, and if you're really slow at it, write out a little bit of it. Like the whole section wudu, write out the obligatory acts of wudu. If they're only able to do a little bit, but just just for the sake of the practice, right? To familiarize yourself with some of the important parts. You know, you're not able to write out the whole thing, but writing it out, Allah Ta'ala says, الَّذِي عَلَّمَ بِالْقَلَمِ, in the first ayah, the one who has taught by the pen. One of the sure ways to learn something is to write things out. And then it's not difficult to decipher what it is. It's not difficult to decipher what it is. And that's a useful investment. That's probably more useful than doing related readings and the like as well. Go ahead.
You mentioned for reviewing, having a study companion. Is the purpose of that to study the whole review with that?
So what does one do with a study companion? There's many possibilities. Right? There's many possibilities. One could review, one could prepare together, or one could review together, right? Review what was covered. One could test each other on the key concepts covered in the lesson. And it doesn't have to be on a weekly basis. You could review together every other week. You could review once a month, have a review session once a month. But we'd highly encourage to pair up with someone for that. It doesn't have to be two people, it can be a group, but it really helps. Right? It really helps. Go ahead.
It's just a comment for anyone who doesn't have the text. There's two people who came forward who want to sponsor the text for students who are taking the class seriously. So anyone who's planning to attend the class on a regular basis and they don't have the book, please come talk to me in the front desk.
So you sponsored a meeting like it's...
They're paying for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I have a cup? No, I have a cup. So, Alhamdulillah. Any, go ahead.
What about to recommend to memorize after
Yeah, I mean, fiqh, the Hanafi fuqaha did not, you have to know it. You have to know it. Should you memorize it? It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. I mean, in Damascus, they still, they would make students of knowledge memorize Nur al-Ilah, which is like 3 times the size of this. And one of the most boring, frustrating, infuriating classes I had was once I became Hanafi, because I used to be Shafi'i, so I became Hanafi. I blundered a lot, but one of the things I did, I decided to study Hanafi fiqh with someone whose intelligence and insight and brilliance was dazzling, Shaykh Muhammad Qaylish. I was like, great. And we'd become friends, or friendly, right? So I figured this will be really exciting. We'll get to discuss the fiqh and like really get into things. Because he's only a few years older than me, much more senior to me. No, but this is going to be... He just said, well, I'm going to make you memorize Nur al-Idah. And the class was basically, I used to go to his masjid, read the section to him, he'd correct me if necessary. I said, okay, next section, next class, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. I'd be like, let's discuss, explain, like, I have questions. But it was one of the greatest benefits, right? One of the greatest benefits, because fiqh is to know. So you have, if someone asks you 10 questions, you can answer the 10 questions. And if someone asks you have 10 questions about tahara, you don't want to know the legal philosophy and the spiritual realities of wudu. You want to know, what do I do next? If this, and that's it. But you can only answer that if you know. So that's, of course, the understanding and all that, that's why we're explaining the text. But the understanding won't remain unless there's something that, the form that preserves understanding is the actual, are the actual texts. So, they say, Man atqana al-mutun nala al-funun. Whoever masters the primary texts, the primers, the introductory texts, will attain the sciences. وَمَنْ قَرَأَ الْحَوَاشِي فَمَا حَوَاشِي. And whoever reads a lengthy text will not attain anything. Alhamdulillah. Okay, so we'll stop here بإذن الله تعالى. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.